Well, thanks for joining me on this call today, Dave. So today I have David Stricker. Um, Thank you for joining us, Dave. If anybody that is familiar with Robert Schmidt's older work from the 1990s will be familiar with Dave's voice because I think you were at pretty much every phase lecture and you were pretty involved during that time. And your voice is on a lot of those early recordings. But so welcome. And I will ask you the same question that I'm talking to everybody about, which is how did you first encounter Robert Schmidt's work and what captured your imagination about what he was doing?
Well, since this happened way back in the old days when everything was not digital, um, I was receiving NCGR newsletters in the mail, magazines, like I think it was like Welcome to Planet Earth, Mountain Astrologer. I was living in Omaha and rural Iowa when all this started, and I was the only astrologer I knew. So, I got the letter from Rob Hand, and of course he was closely associated with NGR saying, "Hey, we're starting this project, we're going to do all this stuff." And I was always looking for another method that was going to, give me better answers. And I'd actually gotten the point that I was getting really frustrated. And so I thought, okay, well, here's some more stuff. Um, the first contact I had was with Ellen, like probably a lot of people, because she was the communicator of the group, like a good Gemini that she was. And so the first time I actually met Bob was at the second conclave. I moved to Maryland while the first conclave was going on. It broke my heart because I really wanted to go. And I bugged Ellen so much about the tapes that she kept saying they're not edited, they're not edited. And I said, I don't care, I'll help. Tell me.
Yeah.
I just got them all, and I, put an outline and said, at so many minutes in there, they switched over to Rob Hand, or Matthew was there and he was speaking. And so the first time I actually met them in person was at the second conclave, which
Okay.
was still in Berkeley Springs. Um, and I was very shy. I know people don't think I'm shy, but when I don't know people, I'm just a total wallflower. I will move around so I don't have to engage in conversations with people. But um, in the evening after the lectures on the stoa, as they called it, out on their front porch, everybody would meet, and then I started interacting with some people. And but I didn't know anybody in the astrological community personally. I didn't go to conferences, it wasn't anything like that. So
So the conclaves were the first conferences that you'd been to.
yep, yep. So I went to the first conclave. We moved. And the first talk, it's funny, I don't remember the first talk I went to. I had to go kind of track it down. It was actually in September. It was the Being in the Zodiac one.
Yes.
Um, I wasn't at, I was really upset I missed the same and other talk, because I talked to other people from it, and they're going, "Oh, it's so exciting. It's amazing. You wouldn't believe what happened there." It's like, okay, but it's that part's not on the tape because, but, so yeah, so I started going, and I think I attended about 7 or 8 of them straight. And then uh, right before, well, right around the same time that Rob Hand left, we moved out of the area. And then all of a sudden I was very far away, and life happened and got crazy. I never lost my interest in it, and I would reconnect occasionally. I also had some health issues that I've been dealing with for 20 years because of it, but not because of that. But I mean, they kept me from kind of being quite as involved as I was, but I've
The
always
phase
been
mhm.
following it.
The phase lectures that you went to, were they held at their home in Berkeley Springs or which one?
This was Cumberland. This was in Cumberland.
They had already moved to Cumberland
Yep.
by the time the phase lectures started. So like How We Aim Our Minds was in Cumberland. They moved to Cumberland in 96, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they might have done one or two of the first ones at like the American Legion, probably in Berkeley Springs
I think
still.
that's right. Yeah.
Um, you
And when
know,
you went to the conclave at Berkeley Springs, the evening portion would be at their house, like you said, on the front porch, but they were pretty large conferences. They rented the American Legion or a hotel or something. I've seen
yeah,
pictures from that
yep.
where it's like a very large conference room in what looks like a hotel.
I don't remember exactly where it was. It wasn't well, I don't remember, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
I will say this was a whole Saturn return ago.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
first reached out to me and I went back and I looked and go, oh, you know what? A lot of the stuff really started going when Saturn went into Pisces. And I go, oh, and you reached out to me. Well, Saturn, because you reached out to me about 10 months ago and Saturn was in Pisces again. And the first talk I went to was when Saturn was Aries, and now Saturn's in Aries now. So, and, it's a full Saturn cycle. I think, oh, how come I haven't accomplished more in the last 30 years? But then pretty hard to compare yourself to what Bob accomplished because he was such a hardworking, dedicated person that it was um, pretty amazing to just listen to him talk and all the background that he always had and all this stuff. Speaking extemporary, talking off the cuff
Yeah.
without hardly any notes or anything.
Yeah.
Um, it was a little intimidating, but he always worked real hard to make things um, understandable because he knew a lot of us didn't have the kind of background. And I think there were times where he would get a little not antsy, but it's like, I really want to share the good stuff that I found, but I got to bring you up to speed on
Yes.
the background so you really understand how important this stuff is. And um, I probably I probably spoke to him briefly on the porch at the second conclave. I don't remember much. I talked to Maggie McPherson a little bit, who unfortunately died way too early, but I think the Phase Watch book was dedicated to her.
Yeah.
And but yeah, once the Phase Talk started, these were much smaller groups, you know, 12 to 15 people, and there was more interaction. And then you
Oops.
know, if you listen to, I call them the tapes. They're not really tapes anymore, but
Yeah.
they
But he'll
they
refer to
are
them as tape. How much more time do I have on the tape?
they
What's
are
left
for
on the
me.
tape?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I still have I digitize them though because I don't have a lot of tape players around anymore.
Yeah.
But Bob would say, "Okay, we're going to take a break now," and of course, he would go out on the back porch to have a cigarette and get a cup of tea. But people would always follow him out there. The dialogues would continue out there. He never really got a break. I mean,
Yeah.
but there was a lot more interaction. There was a lot of back and forth, and everybody that was there was really passionate about it. So it was really exciting to get to attend as many as I did. And I've listened to everything I could get my hands on after I had to move away and stuff. But um, between that and we had the mailing list, the traditions list was one of them that was electronic list where you could post stuff. And I don't even know if those kind of things exist anymore. Uh,
Yeah, and they used to call them listservs, right?
yeah,
Or like
listservs.
there's a
Yep, yep.
listserv, and it's basically like a chat group where
Yeah, and it was a way for all the subscribers to kind of be able to interact. And I was pretty active in that, for a while because once I kind of got my teeth into Valens, and I just wanted to try to understand it. And as I said more than once when I was posting things, I'm conducting my education in public. So
Mm,
it was
yeah.
weird, but we were all learning at the same time. I mean, Bob's translating the stuff and trying to figure it out, and we're reading them too and trying to share it. And we were all beginners kind of at the same time.
Yeah.
So it was a real interesting process together to kind of do that.
Yeah. And for anybody that's listening to this and isn't totally sure of the background, the way that Project Hindsight was started was as this idea of translating the ancient astrological material that had never been translated before. And the way that it was structured was that they would have what they called units of translation. And Ellen and Bob actually, even before Project Hindsight, had their own printing press and they had their own way of publishing. Like now we say like we self-publish something, but really we're using Lightning Source or whatever. But they were physically, rolling out these booklet translations. And the idea was to have units of translation so that they could get this totally, never seen for the last 2000 years material out to the astrological community. And in the first page of that book, it says, this project is supported entirely by the astrological community itself. And so people would pay a monthly subscription fee. I don't remember, was it $15 a month, maybe?
Yeah, it wasn't that. I mean,
And then
granted that
every
was a long time ago, but it wasn't that much.
Yeah. And so every time, then the idea was that they could get these preliminary booklet translations out to the community. People could start digesting. And then as these units of translation were being published, then Bob and other people he was working with are just like sort of working on interpreting what really is this? I mean, there were a lot of discoveries in those first, what they call the Greek track um, booklet series that they were really quite surprised about, right?
Oh, it's funny because after I talked to you, I retired about a year and a half ago, and I was going through and trying to clean out some file cabinets to get rid of some things. And I had a whole folder of Project Hindsight stuff, and they were like letters from Ellen to the subscribers. They were always updates, and most
Yeah.
of them always said, "I'm sorry this is getting out late." And
Yeah.
then, but I'm glad you brought that up because Bob, when he was studying, went after school, he ran a print shop. I think it was in Annapolis.
Yep. Hmm.
And so he was not only was he translating all this stuff and and they're probably editing it and or not editing it, but proofing it and all that stuff. He was printing them all out. And there was one letter I was looking at, Ellen was saying they were so excited because they got a new electric stapler
Yeah.
because, to staple the books together. And oh, and there's another one where there was a problem with the paper wasn't going through the machine right, and they found out, well, the paper had come right from the warehouse and it needed to be dried out a little bit. And there's all these kind of dumb little things that anymore you wouldn't even think about them as being, you know, they used a risograph, whatever that is. I never
Yes.
even looked it
Yes.
up, but
Yeah.
it sounds like the kind of machines they used to have in school when I was a kid, where you used to get the mimeograph pages that, they had a machine that was just rolling and printing them out. I'm sure that doesn't exist anymore. Sometimes I feel like, yep. And then I got on the party line and asked the operator to connect me with.
Well, and it's funny because I'm in the process of having those Greek track booklets reprinted. And I went down, I'm having them done by a local printer down here. And I was talking to the guy about it, and he goes, "Oh," and he's been working there for a long time. And he said, oh, I know this guy, Robert Schmidt. He said he used to bring these down for me to trim. He's like, we never printed them for them, but he always would bring me a box down and I had to trim them. So that was kind of cool. A nice little touch tone there. I was kind of surprised that he's like, oh. I said, well, I want the exact same color blue paper. And he said,
Yeah. Well, and Ellen's talking about, they're stuffing them in, and she said something, anybody wants to come help lick stamps. And I thought, okay, but um, it was a very exciting time because we were all kind of starting at the same, when it came to these, there was, a couple translations of Ptolemy floating around, and there was also some translations of Maternus and Manilius and a few others, but there was no Valens out there. There was no Hephaestus, at least not that I bought any kind of book on astrology I was finding for years and years, and I never came across them. They probably existed, but they weren't like in general
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know
publications.
that they were preserved in the Greek, but yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think that they were in circulation in any modern language. Um, so yeah, a lot of people are always asking me about the chronology too. And I'm gonna just go ahead and share, even as you're talking about, well, I was at this conclave and then there was the phase lectures. I have this color coded chronology here so people can see the sort of launch date for Project Hindsight was 1993, even though, as we've talked about, Ellen and Bob and a friend of theirs separately did have um, a publishing company for translating ancient Greek mathematical works or other other older mathematical works. But in 1993, the translation of astrology project started. And then you can see they had the first two conclaves, which were in Berkeley Springs. So you're saying you were at this one in
Yep.
1995. And then in 1996, he started with the phase lectures. And you can see that was a multi-year endeavor. And it went on mostly through 1996 and 1997. I think 1998 only had a couple. I have just the phase lectures. Let's see.
Yeah. Actually, I have a little note here. In 13 months,
Yeah.
from March of 96 until April of
Hmm.
97, he did 14 weekend talks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the middle of all that, we had the third conclave. Oh, and
Okay.
that also doesn't count that in January of 96, they went out to Long Beach and did
Yeah.
a talk called Ancient Lights in a Modern Sky with, there were other, I think it was like Ken Irving, and there were other people there talking too, but you know, they weren't just doing this, they were also running around trying to help promote stuff. People
Oh,
wanted them to
yeah.
come talk about it because it was, you know, they won a Regulus Award for, the all the work they were doing to innovate. And I mean, Project Hindsight won the award. And, a lot of people wanted to know more about it.
Here's a
So
picture from one of the conclaves, and you can just sort of get a sense of the mood there.
yeah, there's Robert Schmidt, Rob Hand, Dorian Greenbaum. I'm not sure who the lady is next to her, and that's Joseph Crane on the right. So, um, yeah, that I don't know where that is. That doesn't look like where I was. Well, that
Okay.
looks like they're being very informal too. It's not
Everybody looks
part
like
of the
they're having a really good
presentation.
time. Yeah.
We all had a lot of good, I mean, like we were excited about it. We were excited to be there. It was, I mean, when I would go to go to these and the weekend phase talks, they would start Friday night, I'd probably like around 7 o'clock, and there'd be like a 90-minute session Friday night. And then we'd start Saturday morning, and it'd be two 90-minute sessions Saturday morning. We'd take a break for lunch. We'd do two more in the afternoon, and there'd be his, evening lecture, which could be about he called them his surprise lectures. And then, Sunday we would meet for another 3 hours, and then it would end, like Sunday midday, until you got to the later ones where it would start Friday morning and go on through like Mondays, because the later intensives were, there was just so much more. He uh, couldn't cram them into such a short time.
Yeah.
But there was just something about, and these were happening every month. So we've got all these translations that we're trying to understand because there's all these terminology that we don't aren't familiar with. What does properly placed mean? What does suitably situated mean? What is, you know, whatever all these Greek terms were that, I had never come across before, but I think it was surprising to other people in some ways too. But it was, for someone who's always looking for more information, it was way more. I never had to complain about not having enough uh, things to ponder when I got back home.
Yeah.
We'd all go home for a month or 3 weeks and kind of
And then come
digest
right
it,
back.
come
Yeah.
right back and do it again.
Yeah.
And and it was kind of, there was sort of a core group that would come most of the time, and then there were, some people would come at some and not to others. But um yeah, it was kind of a heady time. I mean, we really it was an exciting thing to get to be a part of.
And I know at one point you had talked to me about that the phase lectures were sort of Bob's opportunity to bring all of you guys up to speed, essentially. So the phase lectures were almost like a data dump of like everything that Bob had been working on for the previous 20 years. Um, so it's like all that background he had to sort of share with people in order to even move forward and properly contextualize the astrological material. So I think a lot of times people think about it in the sense of like, oh, well, you translate this ancient astrological material and now you have these new techniques and like it's all just sort of laid out like a little handbook and it's so obvious. So now we know about Time Lords and here's how you can use them. But when you go back and listen to the lectures in real time, as I say, you really get the sense that that's not what it was. It was a much more challenging reconstruction process that was going on. And in order to even have an audience, Bob had to bring everybody up to speed with the phase lectures. And anyway, so
Well, yeah, for someone like me, who I tried to read some philosophy, I tried to read Plato's Republic, I think when I was a freshman in college or something. And I just, of course, now having been around Bob, I realized, well, yeah, the translation was probably kind of flat and academic, and all of the subtle nuances of the multivalence of the language and all that's not exactly, you know, embedded in it. But I was never good with languages. I was horrible at math. So, here I'm going to listen to a guy, who loves math, he loves languages, he loves philosophy, but anything he wanted to talk about, in the end, I realized, oh, well, you know what? Because he all tied it back into astrology. Because he's translating these stuff. He goes, wait a minute, that's the same term that Aristotle used in the Ethics, or Aristotle used in, or somebody else, the Stoics. Oh, the Stoics have this notion, and his background, it was just triggering him
right.
constantly, and that's I one of Ellen's letters again. She would send out periodic letters on how things are going, and she said, Bob's working on Ptolemy, and he says he's never seen a more complex, difficult thing to read, and it's just so amazing. He wished somebody else knew a lot of Greek so he could just share how exciting it was for him to dig into it. So, but it was interesting because he always says, oh, when I first started doing these talks, everybody came in, they wanted astrological techniques, me included. And then, when he started doing that, people would say, well, wait a minute, we want more philosophy. Um, but it was a different approach. And once you listen to him enough, you realize that there was so much more that he was pulling out of it, that he was just dying to share with us. And he did, no matter
Yeah.
what the cost and no matter what the effort. And um I think you had asked me when we were talking originally, well, how did Bob influence me or whatever? And after you had asked me that, and I was kind of thinking about it, I don't know where it came from, but I ran across a quote somewhere on the internet. I wasn't looking for it. It was a quote attributed to Emerson. It said something about the mind that's open to a new idea and never returns to its original size. That's kind of what happened. And but both Bob and Ellen. I mean, like I said, Ellen was doing so much in the beginning. Um, to organize everything to make it go, and she was his sounding board. And because he'll say in the talks, he says, he'll get all excited and come tell Ellen something. She'll say, well, yeah, but what does that mean in my chart? And so
Yeah.
Bob would have to go back and
Yeah.
kind of think some more. So it was a matter of fact, there was a letter. Oh, it was when Valen's book 4 came out, and that was the first one that had the Time Lord stuff in it. And in the letter she sent announcing it, that was surprise flash bulletin. We've just discovered the chronocrator ship, and it's like the Dasha system stuff that we didn't think we had. And on the second page, she said, by the way, before this great discovery, I've been nagging Bob for the umpteenth time to finish one of those books he put in the computer last winter. It's quite a hoard, believe me. I don't know why I bothered. He never listened anyway. This time was no exception. He insisted on working on Valen's book 4, a virtually untouched text, much to my great disgust. The rest is history. Moral, never, but never attempt to interfere with a Capricorn's work.
That's so funny. And that was so them. I mean, what it always reminded me because they're constantly in a process of discovery. And I didn't even meet them until 2000, but what sort of having that next door neighbor's seat to like everything that they were doing. And it always just reminded me actually of, like a digging animal, just like just getting, and then like whatever they pile up behind them that we all think it's like so valuable. No, you have to publish that. You have to publish that book. It's like, no, I'm onto something new. I'm onto something new now. And, we're all just lucky what gets, recorded and what gets saved that we can now have as the archive. But they were always in a process of discovery, all the way through. They never said, okay, um,
Yeah. Well, and Bob was a perfectionist. He wanted everything to be, you know, as good as could be, and he was also an optimist. When the talking tour CD that came out for the Antiochus book that took him several years, and he talked about that whole process on that. Um, it was one of those things that he just constantly, he said if I'd known how long it was going to take me to do this, I never would have done it. But I was an optimist. I just thought, if I work really hard for a
uh,
couple more weeks, I'll have this done. But the harder he worked on it, the more he found, and the deeper the hole went,
yeah,
the
yeah.
rabbit hole. So, but
Ellen was still discovering things, literally right up until her death that she was sharing with me and the unique work that she was doing. And yeah, it was Bob and Ellen both. It's like they were on this process of discovery and unconcealment and they never stopped. And sometimes they were like done with that part because they moved on to something even more exciting, and it's like, oh, well, let's talk about the nautical model. It's like, no, now we're talking about Eudoxus, or however whatever it was. But it's one of my favorite things is to to access Bob's lectures, really in that chronology and watching the progression of his thought is, he's so good at um, talking about the history of thought, the history of human thought, and he makes it so incredibly interesting. But I find it just as interesting to follow the progression of his thought too, through the years, and it just gets better and better. So
well, and he's said it on some of the talks too that, you know, hey, this stuff actually works.
yeah.
I mean, I think coming from his more scientific, you know, earlier background, actually, I think he said something like, if anybody had told him he'd be working on astrological text, with all this restoration kind of work they did in mathematics, he would have been disgusted that somebody even suggests that. And yet, if you listen to the last, 4 or 5 talks, like the configuration intensive or, the image and original, you could tell. I mean, now he can't stop. The information's coming in so fast, and he's
Mhm.
really, it's like overflowing. And
Yeah, and I mean because what he translated and reconstructed has value even just from the perspective of being a historian of science. It has value on its own, what actually regardless of whether it works or not. So and you can almost watch that sort of transition of like looking at it almost as a historian of science, not that he ever didn't believe it, but then sort of like transitioning. And I think that so much of that transition happened because of the absolutely just like detailed and really, really meticulous work that he and Ellen both did in reconstructing or working with the zodiacal releasing from spirit. I mean, their discovery of zodiacal releasing happened kind of early on. I mean, wasn't it in 1994? And it was through the
well,
the
yeah,
translation of Valens.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was in book 4. And but yeah, when they did the Zodiacal releasing workshop, and laid it all out,
Yeah.
and he
Well, yeah, so
realized,
it's like
how
they
can
had been
something this weird work,
yeah. And they had been aware of zodiacal releasing from the time they did the translation, but I mean, they spent years in the early 2000s really drilling down on it. They have notebooks, this thick of just with different biographies, and of course they would confirm. And I think Bob coined the term um, intra-chart validation, to where instead of doing what a lot of people's instinct is to take, like we're going to take 1,000 charts and we're going to validate this by looking at, all these charts and seeing, what plays out and what's consistent. Um, their approach was kind of the inverse of that. And they use the term intra-chart validation, which is like taking one chart or just a couple charts and just drilling down so intensely to where you can see these techniques working. The zodiacal releasing in particular, you can see it working just down to the day, and the effort they put into that. And yes, then they did do the, I think, 2007 zodiacal releasing workshop. But
Well, and there's just um, the whole process of doing that and focusing on one chart. It makes you realize. I mean, it was an amazing project that Gogolin did with, the Mars effect and the athletes and all that. But it's like, okay, so they got Mars on an angle, but what sign it is, who's the domicile lord of that house, and where's that located? And if you start looking at things that way, it's like, well, how am I going to do a database? Because then you start saying, well, but this person also has Saturn as the domicile lord of Mars, but it's in the 12th house, or it's in the 10th house and third house. And, there's so many factors that it makes it a little more difficult to just, isolating individual factors kind of becomes a little strange when you realize what's involved in actually delineating it the way that the Hellenistic writers were talking about doing astrology. You can't just say, "Oh, well, here's a bunch of people with, Saturn in Libra, and what does this mean?" Or here's a bunch of people with Saturn in the 10th. Or I mean, you can get a lot of information out of it, but if you're doing Hellenistically, trying to do it that way, you realize, wow, there's so much. That's why he said it's really hard if you're really going to do all of the stuff for one person for a reading. Um, and I stopped doing. I was doing readings for clients um, from about 87 to about 92, and I kind of stepped back for a while because I realized there were things going on in clients' charts that I didn't really understand. It was probably a failure on my part from not being a more diligent reader uh, about the details and stuff. But then I when this other stuff came out, and I realized, oh well, let's go look at this, because and then I realized, okay, this is not like I could take one or two techniques and just use them the way I was doing the rest of modern astrology. It's like trying to pull a couple words out of, or a couple paragraphs out of another language and import them into English, and then expect that to kind of fit. Well, wait a minute, you didn't translate them from that. What are you talking about? Hey, Marmene and Ananke, or, oikiosis, or, any kind of stuff like that without more context.
yeah. Yeah, I think it took people a long time to integrate the new material too, because like I had mentioned, I met them in 2000 and going to events in like the early 2000s, and, meeting all kinds of different people. And, people would be talking about charts or looking at my chart or whatever. And people were as interested in the material as they were. And they're trying to integrate this. Most of them were, modern astrologers. Now you have like people that's like, well, I'm a Hellenistic astrologer, but it's like at that time everybody was kind of a modern astrologer, and then having to kind of circle back and relearn. It's like, oh, how do I integrate this now into what I was doing? Or do I scrap what I was doing completely and start
Well,
totally new?
yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of us that were going to those space talks that realized, wait a minute, now what do I do? I need to step back and and I don't know for sure, but I think quite a good number of the people that were coming to these phase talks and stuff they weren't making a living doing astrological readings. Um, and or if they did, they were, drastically trying to change how they were doing it on the fly. And I have to say thank you, Kurt Manwaring, for making Delphic Oracle, because trying to figure out what happens in the 32nd year, but you got to convert it to 360-day years first. I mean, Charmaine Horvath made a nice table for us that this day is here, and because you end up counting and doing tedious kinds of things that really some of the tedious stuff actually provides insights, but some of it's just grinding out numbers. And um, he spared me a lot of that work. So thank you, Kurt. I
Yeah,
can't
how
thank you enough for
fortunate
that.
that Kurt got involved in the project and was able to develop a astrology software to do all of these brand new calculations that none of the other astrology softwares were
Yep.
accounting for at that time. Yeah.
Well, and he's got stuff in there to calculate the nautical metaphor, officers things, which you gotta realize I grew up in the Midwest, so nautical metaphors to me, it's like, okay, is the helm in the front or the
Yeah.
back? Or, I was that one didn't resonate with me as much as some of the other stuff did. But fortunately, there's multiple paradigms. Of course, the grammar paradigms didn't help me much either.
Yeah.
Uh, but yes, so that was a big help. But that was all part of the not struggle, but the things we were trying to figure out, how to do and to make stuff, you know, accessible to us.
Yeah. So, so one of the things, because you were talking about that quote of like, once you've had your mind opened, it can't, you never go back. You can't be the same anymore. And one of the things that, um, Ellen and Bob both were really, I mean, they really they thought about how you approach what they would call a problem, right? Like how you approach a problem, or like almost like a math problem or something, but how you approach, the problem of astrology or,
Problem
whatever.
of the house systems.
Yeah, like whatever it is that you're working on and how do you approach it? And it was one of the things that I talked to Ellen about in her final years of like how they achieved so much. And she was just insistent that it was because of the way they approached the problem and that like, to essentially regard the thing that you want to understand almost like regarding it with love and and like allowing yourself to be changed so that you can understand what it is that you're studying. And Bob talks about that a lot, especially I think in his earlier lectures. Like once he really gets on a roll with the nuts and bolts of technique, he doesn't talk so much about these things anymore. But I just want to kind of circle back to some of the things that he talked about early on about how they thought about things. I know like certain things just ring out in my mind of that they would talk about. One of them I think is from Newton, and it's like always thinking on the problem. One time in my life, not with regards to astrology at all, but I had a problem that I was contemplating, and they both encouraged me, always thinking on the problem, always be thinking on the problem. And yeah, certain things like that, they were different, and it was like the way that they embraced that. Um, Another thing that Bob talks about a lot, especially I think in the phase lectures, is the what he calls the art of impertinent questions. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not just accepting, I love sometimes when he goes into just, yeah, the impertinent questions of, why are there 12 signs, or why is it divided into 12, or why anything, why are the signs called zoidion, why that name, and he'll lecture extensively about just something as much of an impertinent question as that. And then the other thing that he talks about is the art of hindsight. Of course, he talks about that a lot.
Yeah.
And wanting to view a problem instead of just like translating something and saying like, okay, here, this is how I'm going to apply it. he held out this goal for himself to view something as though he was looking over the shoulder of the author themselves, right? So
Yes. Well, and he also talked about, that when you first get onto a new idea, it's fresh and vibrant and it fills you with enthusiasm and you really get going with it. But after a while, in my language, and he probably said this too, it becomes common. And now all of a sudden it's almost like a habit or it's not something you even think about. And he would constantly say, well, we have to go back and get started again and see if I can get confused so that we can take it from a new approach, which seems weird at first, but when you realize that's how he got a lot of his insights, was to keep going back. And and we always joke about, in the Timaeus, they say you have to go back before the beginning of the cosmos. Like, what's back before the beginning of the cosmos? What's that? But he always wanted to go back and start over on some stuff again, and it tried it from another approach or see where it would take us. And that was one of the things about the collaborative part about it. There's a lot of times Bob would be chewing on stuff in the back of his mind, and somebody would say something in one of the talks. And there's a bunch of times, if you listen to all the talks, there's times where Bob says, "Okay, we were just talking during the break out on the back porch, and we got to talk about this now."
yeah,
There were little things that we were contributing in our own little way, to because it would give him perspective he hadn't thought about, or that's not how he thinks about things. And so there was some collaboration. I mean, it was mostly Bob, but there were people that he was working with that would help him get more insights. But anybody who thinks that, oh, this was a cult and we all just wanted to sit here and hear what Bob said. Bob interacted with a lot of us, and he took input from a lot of people, and in some ways there was a lot of collaboration going on, and it was pretty cool to see. I mean, this is the guy who never stopped working. And I remember he talked one time, some writer after Aristotle, there was a little thing saying that, just talking about Aristotle, that when he would lay down to think about stuff, he held a ball of some kind over a brass bowl or something. And then when he started to fall asleep, the ball would fall out of his hand and hit the brass bowl and wake him back up so he could get back to work again.
yeah,
And Bob, I don't think Bob slept a lot.
yeah,
um you know um and he always used to talk about wanting to save, oh, I'll work on that problem in my old age, like a retirement project or something. But he would have never retired, even if he had lived longer, because that's just the way he was. He drove that machine that's his body, at high RPMs, and hardly ever let up, because that's what drove him, I think.
yeah.
But
Yeah, you could always recognize him from afar in town because he would walk. He would I don't know if you remember this about him, but he would be thinking on something and he would walk and he would walk with such almost like he was power walking, but he would walk with like such determination, but he would sort of have his head down a little bit and you could just spot him like if you're driving, just doing your errands or riding around town and you sort of recognize him from anywhere, even though there's other people walking and it's like he just had this yeah determination and like intentionality to his walking. You just knew he was just like absolutely chewing on a
I
problem.
I
And
can see him doing that. I
even
can't remember which pre-Socratic it was, but there was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, might have been Thales or somebody, that fell into a hole because he was walking around thinking about philosophical issues. It's like, well, I wouldn't have been surprised if Bob had done that, just because he was so focused on what he was working on.
but yeah, he would just like it was like the determination in his walk. You could almost see the determination in his thoughts, and it stood out because even after he died, and I'd be talking to people about him, like I had more than a couple people go, "Oh, yeah, is he that guy that was always like, always out walking around town, like, with the big hair?" And it's like, "Yeah." I mean, it's not like there's not other people that walk around town, but the determination was definitely different.
Yeah.
So, well, cool. Um, Anything else? Do you have anything else you want to share?
Um, I realized most of the things that I think about or share indirectly come from him, but it's been filtered through me, and it's been so many years that, I always wonder, it's like, well, okay, well, I may not have it quite the way Bob described it, but this is kind of how I've come to interact with it or deal with it. We talked about, the first talk was how we aim our mind, and Dale was telling me he recently went back and started listening to them all the tapes over again, and he said, that very first talk, Bob kind of laid out the whole thing because he'd already given some philosophy talks and stuff at the first two conclaves
Yeah.
before this started. So he had talked about same and other, and it's not, they're not both, they're not neither, and all of the brain twisting parts of all that. But he laid out a lot of what he wanted to talk about in there, and the whole thing about the primary intentionality. I think part of that, for me anyway, is the idea of he was trying to look over the shoulder of the person who was writing it, but I don't know, I don't know if I ever heard him say it, but I realized, oh yeah, he talked about the secondary intentionality of the physicist scribbling away on formulas on a chalkboard, and I said, and I'm thinking, yeah, or an astrologer like maybe me in the past who was just looking at charts, and I'm looking at charts. I don't know the people I'm looking at, especially if you're looking at, like celebrities or famous people or politicians. We don't really know 'em. We don't really know what they're like because we only see what the camera shows or what a biographer wrote, or we're not interacting with those people directly. And there's something about, um, having a direct interaction where you can experience things with like all of your perceptions, all the ways we perceive things. um, we had some severe storms this morning, and the meteorologist was on there, and they had the radar maps, and they're showing the wind shear and all these, great little tools they have. But they still want storm spotters out there, and they're going back and forth with the cameras that are up on the towers because it's one thing to see it in secondary intentionality, and it's another thing to be able to experience it more directly. And that makes me think of a quote from Valens that I have to share. It's near the end of book, or in book 7, and he says, I've written after having made tests without use of fine speech and toiling and experiencing much while being an eyewitness of things. So, for experiencing is better and truer than hearing. That is, the listener has an acquaintance that is hard to trust and doubtful, while one with experience, having been present at many events, may confirm the experience through his remembrance. And to me, that's kind of part of what the primary intentionality, um, piece of
Yeah.
it is.
And the concept of primary intentionality sort of versus secondary intentionality was one of the concepts that Bob needed to bring people up to speed on almost like right away. It, like we talked about in the phase lectures, in order to to move people along into, it's like he wanted people to understand how to approach these ancient texts. And so the lineage for Bob is, his teacher was Jacob Klein, and then Jacob Klein's teacher was Heidegger, and Heidegger's teacher was Husserl. And Heidegger, I think, is the one that introduced the concept of primary or of secondary intentionality, and this idea of, like you said, the physicist working on the chart. It's like, instead of being one with the problem, it's like you're operating on the symbols. So you create a symbol, but then you're actually interacting with the symbols rather than interacting with the the primary um the primary information that you're trying to understand. So I have a it's like a 5 minute clip from that very first phase lecture, How We Aim Our Minds. You feel like listening to that?
Sure.
Okay. It's kind of long, but
Now, these actually
no.
have a historical application in the context of intentionality. So we're going to talk about how the Greeks thought of knowing things, what they regarded as the act of knowing. The Greeks do not think, at least following the writings of Aristotle and Plato, when they address the subject explicitly, In the act of knowing something, the soul becomes identical to the form of the thing it knows. The soul does not act. It doesn't reach out. It is acted upon by the form of the thing that it sees. In the case of perception, it means the visible form somehow acts on the soul. In the case of what we think of as more highfalutin thought, there is another kind of form, which is called the noeta, the look that can only be seen by the mind, the appearance that something has. When you say something is a man, you don't just mean simply his physical shape. You mean that there's something there that constitutes him as a man. According to the Greeks, this form, that can only be seen, so to speak, with the mind's eye, acts on the soul to create the experience of a man, but in this general sense, not the specific man that you're looking at. Now, this is interesting because we don't think of knowing in this manner. We usually do not think that we are simply acted upon merely, that we are only passive in this context. We usually don't think that, do we? I mean, we think that in some way we try to reach out for things. In later Germanic philosophy, for example, you don't say that you just are that the viewer or the seer is simply passive. Instead, what he does is he reaches out and grabs the object that he's thinking about. Okay, a German concept is a Begriff. It's something you grasp. Now, but the initial Greek view has that the thing seen becomes, or the knower becomes identical formally. Not that lump of matter is the same numerically as I am, but I am identical with what I know because the form of that thing is the same as the form that works in my soul. So I'm identical to it. Aristotle says the soul is in some way all things. Now, this is not some kind of mystical union where you are physically and numerically identical with everything. It means that in some way the thing that you know, or what you become like the thing that you know. So you become the same as it in some way. Now, this position, this view of knowing was changed even in late Greek times by the Stoics. And the Stoics did something really interesting. They are the ones that first start to think of the mind as reaching out and doing something. When we have the idea of immediate apprehension, where I grasp or grab onto something, apprehend it, something like the Germanic concept, but a little bit more primitive in some ways that we'll go into. This notion was originally due to the Stoics. In other words, they have a word called catalepsis. We get catalepsy from this, by the way. Catalepsis is a very important philosophical term. It means literally to grasp on or seize upon with the mind. In other words, the mind doesn't just sit there and be in readiness to be acted upon by the forms. Instead, it goes out and seizes on, holds them down, literally, goes out and holds them down. Now, corresponding to this, because we're talking about the relationship between the same and the other, is a concept that is very interesting, even astrologically. You find it particularly in Ptolemy. We tend to say that certain planets are sympathetic to one another, or a planet is sympathetic to a sign, or they have sympathies. And we know, where I'm sympathetic to you, I sort of suffer what you suffer, sort of at a distance. The Stoics had a different word. It was called oikeiosis. Keep writing it in Greek. Comes from the word oikos, which means home. This concept meant, if you've ever read old philosophy works, it's where they say something has a familiarity to something else. Have you read that? That two planets have a familiarity to one another. What the word means is to make familiar to you. What the Stoics thought that in the act, because you're going out and grasping things in your environment, you're not just simply going out and learning things. You are literally making the things in your environment and the things that surround you like you. Have you ever thought about the word to familiarize yourself with something? I mean, think about what that means. It doesn't just mean to become acquainted with something. It means to go out and make you familiarize yourself. Well, you become familiar with something. That object is regarded as sort of part of your extended family, if you want to call it that, right? I mean, you take it into your sphere, you make it familiar. It becomes familiar to you, it becomes family in some way. That means that as you extend your sphere of acquaintance or your sphere of influence, you're treating everybody like family in some way. This is actually the term that Ptolemy uses for the relationship between planets and signs. He doesn't use the word sympathy very often. It does occasionally. The concept's quite different if you think about it. It means that the sign, for example, the ecliptic sign, Capricorn, in fact, familiarizes itself with Saturn as its domicile ruler. That means that Saturn is made familiar to it in some way, because the Greeks regard the planets as having a somewhat subordinate role to the signs.
Could this be what happens in the fourth house?
So anyway, I'll stop there. But
And that's that's part of Bob's whole thing. It's like, don't just say that Saturn's the domicile lord of Capricorn. Why? What, once again, trying to dig into the problem and, using the words that the writers chose. And he says a lot of times, there are easier, more direct words to use, but they use a word that's got multiple meanings, and a bunch of these other meanings also tie into it. But the oikeiosis one just keeps coming back over and over again, and to me, it's it also goes back to the idea that if you become too familiar with something, it becomes common and you don't
yeah,
notice it. You're like, oh, I didn't realize that my brother was like that because I've lived with him my whole life.
yeah,
And that requires an effort to step back and try to look at it from a different perspective.
yeah. So like, for example, with oikeiosis, if he would have chosen just to translate that as ruler, just like, how maybe what would have been more comfortable for modern astrologers to just say, okay, yeah, Saturn rules Capricorn. That language is sedimented. You lose contact with what the actual meaning was, which is like, to make familiar, to bring into one's sphere, or to bring into one's home, which is much more evocative.
It also ties in the whole thing because there's many rants about nominalism, that we
Yeah,
just have a word that means it. It's
it's
a
like,
word that points to something else, but it doesn't describe it. It doesn't really, we all agree that's the word we're going to use, but why? Why
yeah,
are we using that word and what does it really mean? And those are the kind of things that he was really good at kind of challenging us to think, about in a broader sense, and really kind of get a better feel for what these writers were actually doing, and um, hopefully trying to communicate to us. And yeah, it's it's 30 years later. It's a Saturn cycle since I attended all this stuff. I'm still learning from it, even though I'm kind of understanding more about the Heraclitus uh, uh, fragment that said, I'm not quoting exactly, but no man can step in the same stream twice. I'm stepping back into a different stream. I'm not the same man either, but I'm stepping back into this stream going, wow, I wonder why I didn't see that before. Well, I have more perspective now, or I have, I've had a lot of time to chew on this stuff. So it's really interesting. There's there's so much information in these talks. It's really dense, and sometimes it's almost too hard to get it all the first time you go. Well, for me, I don't know how other people do it. I can only tell you how I experience it, and being the way I am, I have to go back and listen to something, more than once or twice because I'm a little thick-headed about stuff. But there is so much, the phase talks were, he says later, well, I was kind of trying to find everything I could to figure out the philosophical system, and I was throwing everything I knew at it, but he was also, there were reasons why. There were words that kept coming up in the translations, and he knew they had deeper philosophical meaning, and he couldn't ignore them. And that's kind
Yeah.
of why he stopped the translating, because he realized, there was so much in here that he couldn't just bring himself to keep translating. And he says that the same words over and over again without really understanding what they were trying to say to us.
Yeah.
Um, and we're really lucky that he did all that.
Yeah, that he did all of that he did all of that work, and so much of it was this reconstruction work that, yeah, it's like it wouldn't have been good enough for him to just do a rote. I mean, he could have done a rote translation. I think he talks about that at one point. He's like, I was pumping these translations out, once a month or whatever. And he's like, then I, realized, okay, there's something so much deeper here, and I got to get this right. It's
Yeah, well, we all knew, we were all told as subscribers that these were preliminary translations, and I look at my Valens books and they're all scribbled on all over the place and highlighted, and I come back a couple years later and it's like, okay, well, now I'm seeing different things that I didn't see the first time, so I get a different color highlighter. And then I
yeah,
finally started writing my little marginal notes. I put dates by them because I keep coming back to the same stuff over and over. But I thought, well, we're going to get a nice copy in the end anyway. But um it was a pretty huge project, and there was, life got in the way with, Bob and Ellen were always having, challenges to deal with on their own as well. And but yeah, it's just amazing. Like I said, I'm very happy. I'm very lucky that we were able to interact with him. Bob taught us, a lot of stuff about, first principles, and like you said, getting back to the roots of things, and really trying to understand it as they were trying to teach it to us. And um, I would have never thought about same and other, and
yeah.
any of these other philosophical terms. I still haven't read the Timaeus. Sorry, Bob. I know we're all supposed to read.
I mean, it was Bob that identified the Timaeus as being this like hugely seminal piece that everyone needs to be familiar with, because the Greek astrology just is obviously pulling from that same line of thought of as Plato's Timaeus. And so, yeah, their goal had been to circle back, retranslate all of the Greek translations according to what had then become their translation conventions, and they were planning to do a multi-volume series where they would sort of like re-release all of the translations that in like a better version, and include even more translations than had originally been done. And of that, in 2009, they put out definitions and foundations, the Antiochus work. And unfortunately, a lot of people were disappointed that none of the other volumes came out. And what happened is, right around that time, 2010, 2011, is when they started discovering that the originator of the system was Eudoxus of Cnidu, and there was absolutely years of work that they dedicated to discovering the true source of this material and how it all fit together, and just and new ways that they hadn't seen before. And it was so incredibly consuming, and in their view much more important than going back and retranslating what they had previously done as a preliminary translation, that's what they worked on. And so, being in the role that
Well,
I'm in, I've heard from some people saying, we were really disappointed that those, and of course we all are,
well,
but
yeah.
it was not in vain. I would say that the what we got instead is what they published as a basic course in Hellenistic astrology, part 1 through 4, and house systems conversation. So part 2 and house systems conversation are currently available on our streaming site. We still have to upload part 1, 3, and 4, but I would say that that basic course in Hellenistic astrology is the pinnacle of their life work. And well, and then also some of some of Ellen's work that was completely unpublished also, I would say, represents the pinnacle of their work. So to people out there that are disappointed that all those volumes weren't complete, I would say that, I mean, I personally do agree that it was more important for them to work on what they did then produce from 2011 to the time of Bob's death. Although it would be nice as a long-term project to still, for Project Hindsight, to still be able to produce the complete translations according to what they settled on as their translation convention. So maybe that's something Project Hindsight can still do, but
Well, even if, if you have access to the book or look at it, I mean, I know you do, but there's so much commentary in the book. I mean, if he just translated what was in there, even if he combined all three, texts that he had to work from and just published it, it would have been a lot smaller book. It wouldn't have taken as long, but all of the commentary that's in there, and you could see that the last couple books he put out before he stopped kind of translating, like book 7 of Valens, the Abu Mishar Solar Returns book, which by the way is called Part 2. And Dale and I were talking about it the other day. It's like, do you have part 1? I go, no, I don't either. I think it's like the Antiochus book is volume 2.
yeah,
They always have big plans for it. But there's just so much more commentary because the more Bob was pulling from it and tying it all together, it's a pretty, there's a lot of rich information in there. It's not the, yes, disappointed. I never got to see Valen's book 8 and 9 translated by Bob. And but you can only do so much, right? I mean,
yeah.
but yeah, it's an amazing, it was an amazing project. It was really cool to be a little part of it. And just to be able to experience it, the amount of things that they did and that we have access to now is just, trust me, well, there's a ton of stuff and all these talks that, you went, oh, why do I want to hear him talk about synchronicity, seriality, and chance? And it's like, because you need to understand that the Greek idea of fate and the whole, Bob says many times, the idea of fate versus free will is not a very good argument, because what part of fate are you talking about, And so that was part of his bringing us up to speed,
Yes.
on all of that. So, and I'm sure different people came with different things. They got different things out of it. But for me, he provided a lot of stuff that I would have had to struggle and probably never would have got. I have a bunch of philosophy books on my shelves, and I go and look something up in them, but I don't read them. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not my nature. I can't, when he said, "Oh, yeah, you should read the Heidegger's Time and Being thing. It's only 24 pages. It's not
Yeah.
that hard to read." It's like, I have it. I tried reading it for a little while. It's like, okay, Bob, how about you just spoon feed it to me and just tell
Well,
me
nobody could bring it alive in the way that he could. I mean, like I commented earlier, uh, the way that he would bring the history of some thought alive is just like one of my favorite things. Like I know in astrology and the fields of consciousness, he spends like 45 minutes early in the lecture basically saying like, okay, let me explain to you how this concept of a field came to be. And he just sort of takes you through this, like the history of science, really, of okay, how did we come up with this concept of a field that's now really quite, as we were talking about earlier, quite sedimented in our mind. Like I'll say like, oh well, you're in my field, and it's like, does anyone really know what we're talking about? And then some of those diversions that he takes into the history of thought are some of my favorites. I know that one in particular. It's like he could just bring it alive. It's like I never thought I'd be so interested hearing about how the transition from Maxwell to Einstein, and the changed our thought about what a field is.
Well, the natural history of time's another great example of that. I mean, I remember that was one of the first talks that it seemed like it was more tapes. I think it was a little longer than some of the other ones. I could be wrong, but there was just so much information in there.
Yes.
that, you know,
It,
that I never think about that kind of stuff. And then he gets you excited and you think about it. And then all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is more, you know, complicated than what we realized.
yeah.
So, so there is one last thing I'd kind of like to do. And this is something I just came across recently was um, Robert Zoller came and lived with Bob and Ellen when he was having his health issues. And I think this was a 2007 kind of conclave that the recordings are not the best. There's a lot of fan noises and other things. But um, when Bob Zoller, when he was going to speak, before he started talking, he wanted to talk about what, because he'd been, can I read? I sort of transcribed it as best I could, but it says a lot about how I kind of feel about Bob and Ellen and what they did. And it's kind of neat to hear it from him too.
Yeah, let's
And
hear it.
there's a lot of, I mean, I don't have the recording, but there's a lot of emotion in his voice when he's talking about it. You know, getting sick, and I can speak from experience, it makes you kind of focus more on what's really important. And you know, he started off and he said, over the last few months, I've lived here at 532 Washington Street in Cumberland, Maryland, with these two lovely people. And then somebody said, we can't hear, or whatever. And then he said, nevertheless, I've been living here at 532 Washington for the last several months, and I've got a vision of what's going on at Hindsight, such as I've never gotten before. Now now it was true that 13 years or so ago, I was part of the Hindsight project, and at that time, for various reasons, I left the project, and I really haven't had much contact with it ever since. However, and what I've seen here in Washington Street in the last 3 months has moved me profoundly. I've seen that the Hindsight Project is essentially a project in which Bob Schmidt thinks about and translates and shares with everybody who will listen with a certain amount of desperation, I suppose. And he said, please listen. And rightly so, because this material is incredibly important. It is only under very special circumstances this kind of work can be done. Now what I have seen in Bob Schmidt, I've seen a man who has dedicated his life, his adult life, to the translation of astrological texts. Not only their translation, but to their exposition, interpretation, and publication. So were this guy to die tomorrow, God forbid, he would have spent the majority of his adult life in this kind of extremely laudable self-abnegation to learning and to the philosophy and astrology such as few of us can ever claim to even come close to. At the same time, and this I think is remarkable, heroic, this kind of behavior where you're not working in a university, not working in a corporate system, but doing what your heart demands you do, and you're doing it as well as your mind and body will permit you to do it, which is truly heroic behavior. I can't tell you how much admiration I have for that. At the same time, I'm mindful in my own life and in the life of my teacher, Richard LeMay, and I think in the life of everyone else, it becomes apparent that this kind of heroic behavior I was describing is impossible without sacrifice. Somebody has to sacrifice in order to make it possible for somebody else to do what Bob's doing. That, of course, in this case, is his wife, Ellen Black, whose heroism consistently continual support and collaboration with this learned hermit, Bob Schmidt, and to do so for 30 years, which is apparently the length of time they've been together, which is to me quite breathtaking. I for myself can't manage to maintain a relationship for more than about 7 years. So somebody who has been able to maintain a relationship for 30 years is supernatural as far as I'm concerned. If it weren't for Ellen's undying cooperation, support, and commitment to the marriage and to Bob Schmidt and to Hindsight, you could be sure there would be no Hindsight. Because while Bob would have gone on doing what he's doing, he can't help himself. This is the way he's wired. He will do it under any circumstance. He's like the Energizer Buddy who keeps thumping away at the drum. Had he not the environment that Ellen had provided from her own family history and her own gumption, feisty assertion of solidarity with her husband, Bob, I don't think he would have gotten nearly as far as he has gotten. For myself, I feel as though I should say these things. First of all, I think it should be known what kind of sacrifice is going on in order to make this material available. I think all of you recognize this to some degree or you wouldn't be here. There is a tendency in the world to overlook what is really happening in front of us. Under these circumstances, if I had not said what I have said, it would be easy for us to come here, absorb what we can about what's being said, and then go home and forget about Project Hindsight, and that would be a great mistake. We're living in a world with precious little heroism because people like myself who see it don't say it nearly enough. So I want to make sure that it's said here today. And I want to thank Bob and Ellen for their sacrifice in the name of astrology. Though I think their real contribution is not going to be understood or recognized or fully appreciated until both of them are 6 feet under and pushing up tulips. Because, like an artist whose work is not appreciated until he or she is dead, so too you have an analogous situation here. This work is groundbreaking, very specialized, and hard for us to appraise. It takes years for us to get any kind of sense of what's really going on here. For that reason, it is too easy for this to be misvalued. I just wanted to say that. Thank you both for what you've done to the astrological community.
That's awesome.
When I heard that, I was like, wow. Yeah. So
Yeah, that's awesome. That's Yeah, that really says it. I think I think they knew that too. I know at one point, Ellen inherited that mansion on Washington Street, and because they would sell their I guess products, if you could, they'd sell their tape sets or sell tickets to their conferences and things like that, but
yeah, but
it was not
that
a
wasn't a lot,
it
trust
was
me.
not a living wage. And so
No.
ultimately the house, which was such a great place to host, thinkers and long-term guests and things like that, ultimately was used to fund their operations. And then when that was depleted, they lost the house. And then they were living in a rental on a couple streets over. And I remember I was driving Bob somewhere, and he got in the passenger seat, and I don't even know how it came up, but he commented that he had come to accept that he said something like that he had come to understand that people wouldn't really understand what he had done for maybe a generation after his death. And it made me so sad. I mean, it sticks with me because it's like something can be true and it can be sad, but then somehow accepting it uh openly is also sad in its own way. um but anyway, I remember him commenting about that, and it's like, yeah, like what he did, it was so much more than just bringing forward some astrology translations, like what he really did. um
Well, and Zoller knows what that was like because, it was just him and Benatti. And, he was doing that back in the 70s. And, there may have been a few other people doing stuff back then. I don't know. But, as far as being able to find any books or stuff, he was kind of a, lone voice in the wind for a while there. And I think he realized, plus he was trying to translate stuff, and, he knows how hard that is. And so it was pretty amazing to hear it. Like I said, it's kind of hard to read it without getting emotional too,
yeah,
because, they kind of gave everything they had to do what they did.
yeah,
And,
it did.
they had to give up that house in the end. They could have sold that house and tried to live somewhere else small and had a little bit of money, but they still would have plowed it all back into the project. And,
Yeah,
it's just, it's how they were.
yeah. Yeah. Wow. And we're the better for it. Thank you so
Yes,
much for talking to me today. I
you
really
bet.
appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right, cool. We'll
Okay.
talk soon.
All right. Thank you.